All right, this week's topic is titled The American Crisis. This is our week 11 already. It's part of the Revolutionary Era as we kind of get to our midway point. The reason it's called the American Crisis is for a couple reasons. On the American side, we've talked about all this momentum they've gathered through 1776. The publication of Common Sense led to just this enormous amount of inspiration amongst the colonies and the leaders there to declare independence, and they eventually win that independence in 1776, or not win it, but they declare it in the famous document written by Thomas Jefferson, and they're riding this really big high into the battle with the British. One thing that they weren't really anticipating, though, was that the British were willing to invest so much money, time, manpower, energy into keeping the colonies in their empire. And so these two very powerful interests collide, and it leads to, again, what we call the American crisis. We should probably first start off by talking about the mission of the British, which was to basically take control of New York. That was their main goal, because if they took control of New York, they could do many things. First of all, they'd have access to the Hudson River, which would lead them through all of these different parts of the colonies. But then also it would divide the New England colonies from the middle and southern colonies. So if they could take control of New York, they could effectively divide and then conquer the colonies. The second thing, and the reason they chose New York instead of places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, is that New York had the largest amount of loyalists in the colonies. So they knew it was sort of like a home field advantage if they were able to take hold there, and that's exactly what they ended up doing. On the same day the Declaration was signed, July 4th, 1776, General Howe and his men begin to set up shop and set up their base on Staten Island, which is there on the bottom left-hand corner. They bring over thousands of men, and when they bring over these men, it increases the amount of British military to over 40,000 people in the colonies. Now that is enormous compared to the American manpower for military, because there were only 20,000 soldiers in the Continental Army at that point. So the British have, like I said, a great advantage. But anyway, General Howe sets up shop on Staten Island and waits for about a month and a half to, again, set up base there, and then attacks Brooklyn, where George Washington and his men are at the time. And this is known as the Battle of Brooklyn, but it's not really much of a battle because Washington and his men end up evacuating, and they evacuate across the East River into Manhattan. When they get to Manhattan, they fight another battle, and they race up to what we know today as Harlem, and at the time it was called Harlem Heights. And what we have up here is another battle that doesn't last very long, and George Washington again escapes with his men across into White Plains, New York, where there's another battle, and he loses there, and he's chased basically by General Howe through New York into New Jersey and then into Pennsylvania. And so what this ends up leading to is nearly 3,000 of George Washington's men are taken capture and made prisoners for the duration of the war. They aren't released until the very end. So a lot of them end up dying in prison. But Washington was able to save a good portion of his men as they made their way into Pennsylvania. And what we have there is General Howe chases them there. General Howe himself, though, goes back to New York and sends one of his other generals, General Rahl, to sort of finish the job. And Washington ends up across the Delaware River from Trenton, New Jersey, and he's in Pennsylvania. Okay, in Trenton, New Jersey is General Rahl and his men. Many of them are the Hessian soldiers that were sent from Germany to assist the British. And General Rahl is basically waiting for the right time to attack. It's the middle of winter. He's a little cautious, doesn't want to be too aggressive and lose many of his men, and so he's planning his attack. Washington, on the other side, though, is very defeated. The morale of the soldiers is at an all-time low. Many of them want to get out of the Army. Many of their enlistments, which is their signing up to their contract with the Army, runs out at the end of 1776. And Washington realizes that in order to raise morale amongst his men, in order to keep them in the Army, he's going to have some success at some point, because many of these people maybe aren't as die-hard about independence as some others. And many of them consider themselves to be British, but are fighting on the American side. And so and they don't want to be on the losing side. So what he realizes is he needs a victory. Another person that realizes he needs a victory is Thomas Paine. And we talked about Thomas Paine's writing in Common Sense early in 1776, and he does it once again with his writing. he writes an article that's published in the Pennsylvania Journal and then is spread throughout the colonies titled The American Crisis. And one of his more famous quotes from that is, "The more challenging the conflict, the greater the triumph." And it basically works as like a halftime speech that a coach would give, that the game's not over. We still have plenty of power. We still have so much war to fight, and it inspires people. George Washington has it read to his soldiers. It's spread throughout the colonies, and it really works to sort of offset all the negatives that have been going on, because this is a positive thing that inspires and raises the morale of his soldiers. Okay, and it's published on December 19th, 1776, and that's right before Christmas. And typically during that time, one of the reasons General Rahl didn't attack was because it's Christmas time. Basically, people are celebrating in Trenton. The British and the German soldiers are celebrating together, and it's sort of a week of festivities. The plan that General Rahl has is to attack after that. Now, General Washington takes advantage of this. He knows that Germans, typically in this case, the German soldiers, like to drink. British soldiers as well. It's Christmas time. If you guys think about your own families, that's typically a day that maybe people get a little bit crazy. And General Washington takes advantage of that. And on the night of December 25th, 1776, Christmas night, he crosses the Delaware River in a surprise attack on Trenton and the soldiers there. This is known as Washington's Crossing. And it's a heroic thing. You can see there they're sledding through icebergs that are running down the river. His men are freezing. They got horses on boats. They're trying to get across this river. And when they do, their surprise attack on Trenton is successful. They then move on to Princeton, which is down the road, and defeat more of the British soldiers there. And so these two victories within a week of each other, Trenton and then the victory at Princeton, does a lot for morale. It raises the spirits of the Continental Army soldiers. It lets them know that this war is winnable. And it is another example of Washington's greatness and leadership. He evacuated his men several times in defeat, but in that process saved their lives and kept hope alive for America. And then he also knew when the right time was to attack. He was very patient, waited for an opportunity, and then capitalized on that opportunity. Okay, and these two battles, like we said, sort of turned the tide. So it started out as a losing streak. Washington, along with Thomas Paine's inspiration, was able to turn that and turn the tide into a couple of successes, and this leads to many of these soldiers staying in the Army and fighting on in future battles. All right, so I talked a lot today. If it was a little quick, let me know. Shoot me an email, Twitter, whatever, and let me know if you're having any problems. You guys have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.